Imagine you're standing at the edge of a narrow mountain pass. The year is 480 BC. The summer heat is brutal, and somewhere ahead of you, an army so vast it reportedly took 3 days just to march past a single point is moving toward you. Behind you lies everything you know, your city, your family, your civilization. You have roughly 300 men, and you are not retreating. Most people know this moment. Most people have seen some version of it, the shields, the red cloaks, the defiance. But here is what most people do not know. The story of Sparta is far stranger, far more complicated, and in many ways far more fascinating than the legend. The real Sparta was not a comic book. It was something harder to categorize, a society that produced extraordinary soldiers and extraordinary suffering in equal measure, that lasted for centuries while defying almost every assumption we make about how a successful civilization should work, and that left a legacy so powerful it is still shaping how we think about discipline, sacrifice, and the nature of strength more than 2,000 years after its walls crumbled into dust. This is not the Sparta of the movies. This is the real one, and the truth is more interesting than the myth. To understand Sparta, you have to understand where it sits. The Peloponnese is the large peninsula that forms the southern half of mainland Greece, connected to the rest of the country by a narrow strip of land. It looks on a map a little like a hand reaching down into the Mediterranean. In the southeastern part of that peninsula lies a long, fertile valley carved out by the Eurotas River. The valley is surrounded on both sides by dramatic mountain ranges, the Taygetos to the west, rising to over 2,400 meters, and the Parnan Range to the east. This geography is not incidental. It is everything. Most Greek city-states built walls. Athens had walls. Corinth had walls. Thebes had walls. Sparta, for most of its history, had almost none. The Spartans looked at those mountains and said, "Those are our walls." The valley of the Eurotas was naturally defensible, naturally fertile, and naturally isolated. You could not easily sneak an army through those passes. You could not easily supply one either. The geography shaped the psychology. Sparta developed in a kind of proud, productive isolation that made it simultaneously one of the most powerful states in Greece and one of the most internally focused. The city itself in ancient times would have surprised you. There was no grand urban center, no monumental architecture in the Athenian sense. Ancient sources describe Sparta as a collection of villages, 5 of them, called obai, spread along the Eurotas Valley and eventually unified into a single political community. The philosopher Thucydides, writing in the 5th century BC, made a famous observation: if Sparta were ever abandoned and only its ruins remained, future generations would find it hard to believe it had ever been as powerful as it was, because it lacked the great buildings and monuments of a city like Athens. He was right. Sparta's power was not stored in stone, it was stored in people. But how did those people come to be the way they were? That story begins not with heroism but with conquest, and with a moral compromise that would define Spartan society for centuries. Sometime around the 10th or 9th century BC, the exact dates are genuinely uncertain, and historians debate them. The people who would become the Spartans migrated into the Eurotas Valley. They were Dorian Greeks, part of the broader movement of peoples that reshaped the Greek world after the collapse of the earlier Mycenaean civilization. They settled, they farmed, and over time they began to expand. The neighboring region of Laconia fell under their control. Then, in what ancient sources describe as a series of wars beginning around the late 8th century BC, they turned their eyes westward, toward a fertile region called Messenia. Messenia was not empty. It was inhabited by other Greeks, people with their own communities, their own traditions, their own sense of identity. The Spartans conquered them, and then, rather than simply absorbing them or driving them out, they did something that would haunt Spartan society for the next 3 centuries. They enslaved them. The word the Spartans used was helots. The etymology is disputed. Some scholars connect it to a word meaning captured, others to a specific place name, but the reality was unambiguous. The helots were a population of enslaved people, bound to the land, forced to work the farms that fed the Spartan citizen class, and required to hand over a fixed portion of their harvest each year. They could not leave. They could not own property in any meaningful sense. They could be killed by Spartan citizens under certain circumstances with apparent legal impunity. Here is the first of the wow facts I promised you, and it genuinely earns that description. Every year, the Spartan state formally declared war on the helots. not as a metaphor, as a legal act. This declaration, described by ancient sources including the philosopher Aristotle, meant that killing a helot did not constitute murder under Spartan law, because the state of war made it technically legitimate. The purpose seems to have been partly practical. It allowed Spartan secret police, an institution called the Crypteia, to move through the countryside at night and eliminate helots who were considered dangerous or who showed signs of organizing resistance. But it was also a ritual of domination, a yearly reminder of who held power and who did not. The helots outnumbered the Spartan citizens by a ratio that ancient sources suggest was somewhere between 7-1 and 15-1, though the precise figures are debated. This demographic reality was not a background detail. It was the central fact of Spartan life. Everything, and I mean everything, about the famous Spartan system of education, military training, social organization, and cultural values can be traced back, directly or indirectly, to the problem of how a small citizen class maintains control over a vastly larger enslaved population that has every reason to revolt. The Messenians did revolt twice. The First Messenian War, traditionally dated to around 743 to 724 BC, ended with Spartan victory and the initial subjugation of Messenia. But roughly a generation later, the Messenians rose again in what is called the Second Messenian War, a conflict that ancient sources describe as lasting nearly 2 decades and nearly destroying Sparta entirely. The poet Tyrtaeus, who may have been a Spartan or at least closely associated with Sparta, wrote verses during this period that survive in fragments. Urgent, martial poetry calling on citizens to stand firm, to fight, to not disgrace their ancestors. The desperation in those lines is real. Sparta came close to losing, it survived. But the experience transformed it. In the aftermath of the Second Messenian War, Spartan society underwent a reorganization so thorough and so radical that later generations attributed it to a single legendary lawgiver named Lycurgus. The historical status of Lycurgus is genuinely uncertain. Plutarch, writing centuries later, acknowledged that nothing can be stated about him which is not disputed. He may have been a real person who lived around the 9th century BC. He may be a composite figure representing a series of reforms. He may be largely legendary. What is not disputed is that by the classical period, the 5th and 4th centuries BC, the era of the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War, Sparta had developed a social system unlike anything else in the Greek world, and that system had a name, the agoge. The agoge was the Spartan educational and training system, and it began early. At birth, Spartan infants were examined by a council of elders. This is one of the most discussed and most debated aspects of Spartan society, and it is worth being precise about what we actually know. Ancient sources, including Plutarch, describe a practice of examining newborns and exposing those deemed weak or deformed, leaving them at a place called the Apothete on Mount Taygetos. Modern scholars debate the extent and regularity of this practice, and some argue it has been exaggerated or misunderstood in the ancient sources. What seems clear is that Spartan society placed enormous value on physical fitness and that the state claimed an interest in children that overrode purely private family decisions. The details, however, remain contested. What is less contested is what happened to the children who survived and grew up in Sparta. At age 7 years old, Spartan boys were taken from their families and enrolled in the agoge. They lived in communal barracks with their age group. They were supervised by older boys and by adult officials. They were fed deliberately insufficient rations, not to starve them, but to teach them to forage, to steal food if necessary, and to endure hunger without complaint. They slept on beds of reeds that they had to cut themselves from the banks of the Eurotas, without cushions or blankets, even in winter. The training was physical, but it was also psychological. Boys were taught to endure pain without showing it. They were taught to speak in short, direct sentences, the origin of our word laconic, from Laconia, the region Sparta controlled. They were taught to answer questions from adults with precision and economy of words. They were taught that excessive talking was a sign of weakness. They competed constantly against each other and against older groups. They were periodically beaten, not as punishment, but as a test of endurance. Ancient sources describe a ritual at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, where boys competed to steal cheeses from an altar, while older Spartans whipped them, with the goal being to endure as long as possible without crying out. I want to be careful here about something. These accounts come primarily from non-Spartan sources writing centuries after the fact, Plutarch, Xenophon, and others, and there is scholarly debate about how accurately they describe actual Spartan practice versus a somewhat idealized or exaggerated version of it. The Spartans themselves left almost no written records. This is not an accident. The Spartan system deliberately discouraged the kind of intellectual and literary culture that produced historical records. Almost everything we know about Sparta was written by outsiders, many of whom were either fascinated admirers or hostile critics. When you read about Sparta, you are always reading through a lens. That said, the broad outlines of the Agoge are supported by enough independent sources that most historians accept them as substantially real. The system was real. The communal living was real. The physical hardship was real. The emphasis on endurance, discipline, and collective identity over individual comfort was real, and it produced something genuinely remarkable. By their late teens and early 20s, Spartan men who had completed the Agoge were among the most physically capable and tactically disciplined soldiers in the ancient world. But the training was not just about fighting. It was about creating a particular kind of human being, one whose primary identity was as a member of the Spartan citizen community, the Spartiate class, rather than as an individual or even as a family member. The Greek word for this community was the homoioi, sometimes translated as the equals or the peers. In theory, all Spartan citizens were equal. They ate the same food in communal mess halls called syssitia. They wore the same simple clothing. They were forbidden from engaging in trade or manual labor. That was the helots' work. And they were expected to subordinate personal ambition to collective discipline. The syssitia deserves a moment of attention because it illustrates how thoroughly the Spartan system penetrated every aspect of life. Every adult male Spartan citizen was required to belong to a mess group, typically around 15 men, and to contribute a fixed monthly portion of food, barley, wine, cheese, figs, and a small amount of money for additional provisions. The famous black broth of Sparta, a stew made from pork, blood, vinegar, and salt, was reportedly so unpleasant that a visitor from Sybaris, a city famous for its luxury, once tasted it and said he finally understood why Spartans were not afraid to die. The story is probably apocryphal, but it captures something real. The Spartan mess was not about pleasure. It was about equality, shared identity, and the deliberate rejection of the kind of private luxury that might make a man more attached to his personal comfort than to his city. Membership in the syssitia was not automatic. A man had to be voted in unanimously by his mess group. If even one member voted against him, by pressing a piece of bread into a special vessel rather than simply dropping it in, the candidate was rejected. And a man who could not maintain his contributions, perhaps because his farm had failed, lost his citizenship. Full Spartan citizenship was conditional on continuous participation in this communal system. It was, in a very real sense, something you had to keep earning. Now, here is where the story becomes genuinely complex. Because Sparta was not simply a military machine with no other dimensions. It had a political system that was, in some ways, remarkably sophisticated, and in other ways, deeply contradictory. Sparta was governed by two kings simultaneously. Not one king with a deputy, two co-equal kings from two separate royal dynasties, the Agiads and the Eurypontids, ruling in parallel. This dual kingship was unique in the Greek world and is one of the most discussed aspects of Spartan governance. The kings were not absolute monarchs. Their power was significantly constrained by other institutions. They served as commanders of the army in the field, they had certain religious functions, and they held seats on the Council of Elders. But they were checked by a board of 5 annually elected officials called ephors, who held enormous practical power, could summon the kings to account, and could even put a king on trial. Two kings were also a check on each other. It was much harder for one man to accumulate tyrannical power when another king of equal standing could oppose him. The Council of Elders, the Gerousia, consisted of 28 men over the age of 60 plus the two kings, for a total of 30. Members served for life and were elected by the Assembly of Citizens, but the election method, according to Aristotle, was essentially a shouting contest. Candidates appeared before the assembly one by one, and the loudest sustained cheering determined the winner. Aristotle, who was not a fan of this system, called it childish, but it was also, in a strange way, democratic. It meant that popular sentiment, however crudely expressed, determined who held power. The citizen assembly, called the appella, included all male Spartan citizens over 30. It voted on major decisions, war, peace, alliances, legislation, but it did so by acclamation rather than individual ballot, and it could not initiate legislation, only approve or reject proposals from the Gerousia. This was not Athenian democracy, but it was also not simple autocracy. Sparta had a mixed constitution, elements of monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy woven together in a way that the Greek philosopher Polybius would later describe as a model of balanced government, though he was writing centuries later and may have been somewhat idealistic about it. What about Spartan women? This is a subject where the gap between ancient perception and modern understanding is particularly wide, and where the sources are particularly unreliable, but also particularly interesting. Spartan women had a status that was unusual and in some ways unique in the ancient Greek world. In Athens, respectable women of the citizen class were expected to remain largely confined to the domestic sphere, to avoid appearing in public, and to have minimal involvement in civic life. Spartan women, by contrast, received physical training. They competed in athletic events. They were expected to be strong and healthy, explicitly because the Spartans believed that strong mothers produced strong children. They could own property. In fact, by the classical period, ancient sources suggest that Spartan women controlled a substantial portion of the land in Laconia, partly because so many men died young in military service. Spartan women were also known for a particular kind of direct, unsentimental speech. There is a famous genre of ancient anecdotes called the Sayings of Spartan Women, collected by Plutarch, in which Spartan mothers send their sons off to war with instructions like, "Come back with your shield or on it." The meaning is clear: return victorious or return dead. Do not return having thrown away your shield to flee, which was the ultimate act of cowardice in hoplite warfare. Whether any individual Spartan mother actually said this exact thing is impossible to verify. But the genre reflects a real cultural expectation. Spartan women were expected to value their sons' honor and their city's success over their own personal grief. This is, depending on your perspective, either admirable or deeply disturbing. Probably it is both. The Spartan system asked enormous things of everyone: men, women, children, and above all the helots who had no choice in the matter at all. Now we need to talk about the Persian Wars, because this is where Sparta's reputation was forged in the most dramatic and consequential way. By the early 5th century BC, the Persian Empire was the largest political entity the Western world had ever seen. Under Darius I, and then his son Xerxes, it stretched from Egypt to the borders of India, encompassing dozens of peoples, languages, and cultures. When the Greek cities of Ionia, the western coast of modern Turkey, revolted against Persian rule in 499 BC, Athens and Eretria sent ships to support them. The revolt failed, but Darius did not forget the Greek intervention. In 490 BC, he sent a force to punish Athens and Eretria. The Athenians, without Spartan help, the Spartans were delayed by a religious festival, met the Persians at Marathon, and won a victory that shocked the ancient world. But everyone knew this was not over. Darius died before he could mount a larger expedition. His son Xerxes spent years preparing one of the largest military operations in ancient history, a massive invasion of Greece itself, designed not just to punish Athens, but to bring the entire Greek peninsula under Persian control. The Greek city-states faced a choice. Many of them, particularly in the north, chose to submit, a decision the Greeks called Medizing, giving earth and water to the Persian king as symbols of submission. Others chose to resist. The resistance coalition was led by Sparta, which was the dominant military power in Greece and the head of an alliance called the Peloponnesian League. The plan was to hold a series of defensive positions while the Greek fleet engaged the Persian navy. The first land defense was at Thermopylae, a narrow coastal pass between the mountains and the sea in central Greece, where the narrowness of the terrain would neutralize the Persian advantage in numbers. And here is where the legend and the reality intersect in a way that is genuinely worth examining carefully. The force that held Thermopylae was not 300 Spartans alone. This is important. The full Greek force at Thermopylae numbered somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 men, including contingents from Thespiae, Corinth, Thebes, Phocis, and other cities. The Spartans were 300 in number, specifically 300 men who had living sons, a detail that ancient sources emphasize as a deliberate choice, ensuring that the Spartan royal lines and family continuities would survive even if these men did not. For 2 days, this force held the pass against the Persian army. The narrow terrain meant that Persian numbers were irrelevant. Only so many men could fight at once, and the Greek hoplites in their tight formation were simply better at that kind of close-quarters fighting than the Persian infantry. The Persian immortals, Their elite troops were thrown at the Greeks repeatedly and thrown back repeatedly. Xerxes, watching from a throne on a nearby hill, reportedly rose from his seat 3 times in alarm as his best soldiers were repulsed. Then a local man named Ephialtes, and his name has been a byword for treachery in Greek ever since, showed the Persians a mountain path that led around the pass. When the Spartan king Leonidas learned that his position was about to be outflanked, he sent most of the Greek allies away. Some left willingly. The Thespians, famously, refused to leave and died alongside the Spartans. The Thebans may have surrendered, the sources are disputed on this point. The Spartans and the Thespians, roughly 700 men total, made their last stand. They died, every one of them. The Persian army swept through the pass and marched south toward Athens. But here is what the legend sometimes obscures. Thermopylae was a tactical defeat that contributed to a strategic victory. The delay bought time. The Greek fleet, fighting simultaneously at the naval battle of Artemisium, was able to withdraw in good order. Athens was evacuated, a decision of extraordinary collective courage, the entire civilian population abandoning their city. And 2 months later, at the naval battle of Salamis, the Greek fleet destroyed the Persian navy in the straits between the island of Salamis and the Athenian coast. Without naval supply lines, Xerxes could not sustain his army in Greece indefinitely. He withdrew to Asia, leaving a large land force under his general Mardonius to continue the campaign. The following year, 479 BC, the Greek alliance met Mardonius at Plataea in Boeotia. The Spartan commander Pausanias led the Greek force. The Battle of Plataea was the decisive land engagement of the Persian Wars, a Greek victory that ended the Persian threat to mainland Greece for good. It was in many ways a greater Spartan achievement than Thermopylae, but it is far less famous, partly because it lacks the romantic tragedy of the last stand, and partly because it was a victory rather than a defeat. The Persian Wars made Sparta's reputation permanent. The image of the disciplined, fearless Spartan warrior became one of the defining images of the ancient world. But the aftermath of the Persian Wars also set in motion the forces that would eventually destroy Sparta's dominance. Here is the central tension of the 5th century BC. The Persian Wars required Greek unity, but Greek unity was inherently unstable. Athens and Sparta were too different, and in some ways too similar in their ambitions, to coexist peacefully as co-leaders of the Greek world. Athens, energized by its naval victory at Salamis, transformed itself into a maritime empire. The Delian League, originally a defensive alliance against Persia, became under Athenian leadership something closer to an Athenian empire. With tribute flowing into Athens, Athenian officials overseeing allied cities, and Athenian military power projecting across the Aegean. Athens grew wealthy. It built the Parthenon. It developed the most sophisticated democratic institutions in the ancient world. It became the cultural capital of Greece, the city of Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, Socrates, Herodotus. It was everything Sparta was not: open, cosmopolitan, intellectually adventurous, architecturally magnificent. Sparta watched this with growing alarm. Not because Sparta was envious of Athenian culture, Spartans were genuinely indifferent to most of what Athens valued, but because Athenian power was destabilizing the balance of the Greek world. Sparta's dominance rested on its land power and its network of Peloponnesian allies. An Athens that controlled the seas and commanded vast tribute was a fundamentally different kind of threat than anything Sparta had faced before. The result was the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that began in 431 BC and lasted, with interruptions, until 404 BC, 27 years. It was the greatest war the Greek world had ever fought, and it was, in the end, a catastrophe for everyone involved. Thucydides, who lived through it and wrote its history in one of the greatest works of historical writing ever produced, described it as the greatest disturbance in the history of the Hellenes. The war had a fundamental strategic paradox at its heart. Athens was the dominant naval power. Sparta was the dominant land power. Neither could easily strike the other's core strength. The Spartan strategy was to invade Attica, the region around Athens, annually, burning crops and hoping to provoke a decisive land battle. The Athenian strategy, devised by the statesman Pericles, was to refuse that land battle, withdraw behind the city walls, rely on the navy to maintain supply lines and project power, and wait for Sparta to exhaust itself. The strategy was sound, but it could not account for everything. In 430 BC, a devastating plague struck Athens, probably typhoid fever, though the exact disease is still debated by medical historians. It killed perhaps a quarter of the Athenian population. It killed Pericles himself. It broke Athenian morale in ways that military defeat alone might not have. And it set in motion a series of increasingly reckless Athenian decisions. The most catastrophic of these was the Sicilian expedition of 415 to 413 BC, one of the great strategic disasters in military history. Athens decided to send a massive naval expedition to conquer Sicily, specifically the powerful city of Syracuse. The expedition was enormous, hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors, an investment of resources that represented a significant fraction of Athenian power. It ended in total annihilation. The entire force was destroyed, ships sunk, soldiers killed or enslaved. Athens lost a generation of its best fighting men and much of its naval strength in a single catastrophic campaign. Sparta, with Persian financial support, a deeply ironic development given that Sparta had led the resistance against Persia less than a century earlier, was able to build a fleet capable of challenging Athens at sea. In 405 BC, the Spartan admiral Lysander destroyed the last significant Athenian fleet at the Battle of Aegospotami. Athens was blockaded, starved, and forced to surrender in 404 BC. The long walls connecting Athens to its port were torn down. The Athenian Empire was dissolved. Athens was forced to become, briefly, a Spartan client state. Sparta had won. After nearly 3 decades of war, it was the undisputed hegemon of the Greek world. And then, within a generation, it threw it all away. This is the part of Spartan history that the movies never tell, because it does not fit the myth. The myth is about Spartan invincibility, Spartan discipline, Spartan excellence. The reality of Sparta after 404 BC is a story of imperial overreach, internal contradiction, and a demographic crisis that turned out to be fatal. The problem was this: the Spartan system was extraordinarily good at producing excellent soldiers, but it was extraordinarily bad at producing enough of them. The citizen class, the homoioi, the full Spartan citizens who had completed the agoge and maintained their mess contributions, had always been a small group. But by the 4th century BC, it was becoming catastrophically small. The reasons were multiple. Military casualties over generations of warfare took a constant toll. The land inheritance system concentrated estates in fewer hands, meaning that men whose farms were divided or lost could no longer afford their mess contributions and fell out of the citizen class. The birth rate among full citizens was apparently declining, and the agoge itself, paradoxically, may have contributed. A system that demanded so much of men from age 7 onward may have made family formation and child-rearing secondary concerns. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, the numbers tell the story. The Spartan force included roughly 700 full Spartan citizens, homoioi, out of a total army of perhaps 10,000. A century earlier, at Plataea, Sparta had fielded 5,000 full citizens. The citizen class had shrunk by more than 80% in 100 years. This is not a minor demographic shift. It is a civilizational crisis, and at Leuctra, the crisis became a catastrophe. The Theban general Epaminondas, one of the most brilliant military minds of the ancient world, a man who deserves a video of his own, had spent years studying Spartan tactics and developing a counter. The standard Greek hoplite battle formation placed the strongest troops on the right flank, which was the position of honor. Armies would advance, the right flanks would win, and then the battle would be decided by which right flank could wheel and strike the enemy's exposed left before the enemy's right flank could do the same to them. Epaminondas broke this pattern completely. He concentrated his best troops, the Sacred Band of Thebes, an elite unit of 300 paired warriors, on his left flank, making it 50 ranks deep rather than the standard 8 to 12. He angled his formation so that this massive left flank would strike the Spartan right, where the Spartan king Cleombrotus and the best Spartan troops were positioned, while his weaker right flank was held back, refusing to engage until the decisive blow had been struck. It worked. The concentrated Theban left crashed into the Spartan right with overwhelming force. Cleombrotus was killed. The Spartan right collapsed. And with the Spartan right gone, the rest of the army had no choice but to retreat. 400 Spartan citizens died at Leuctra. Out of roughly 700, more than half the remaining full citizen class, killed in a single afternoon. The shock to Sparta was existential. A Spartan force had been defeated in a pitched land battle for the first time in living memory, arguably for the first time in centuries. The invincibility was gone, and with it went the psychological foundation of Spartan hegemony. Epaminondas followed up Leuctra by invading the Peloponnese itself, something no enemy army had done in living memory. He marched to the very edge of Sparta's territory. He could not take the city itself, partly because of the terrain and the desperate resistance, but he did something almost as damaging. He liberated Messenia. The Helots of Messenia, the enslaved population whose labor had fed the Spartan citizen class for 3 centuries, whose subjugation had been the founding premise of the entire Spartan system, were freed. A new city, Messene, was founded on the slopes of Mount Ithome as the capital of an independent Messenian state. The walls of Messene, built in 369 BC, still stand today, massive, impressive fortifications that were a deliberate statement. Messenia would never be enslaved again. For Sparta, this was not just a military setback, it was the removal of the economic foundation of the entire social system. Without the helot labor that had freed Spartan citizens from farming, the agoge, the syssitia, the entire structure of Spartan life became impossible to sustain in its original form. Sparta did not immediately collapse. It remained a significant power for another century and more, but the trajectory was now irreversible. The great age of Sparta was over. And yet, and this is where the story becomes genuinely strange, Sparta's influence was only beginning. Here is the second major wow fact of this story, and it requires a little setup. In the centuries after Sparta's military decline, something remarkable happened. Sparta became fashionable. Not just in Greece, but eventually across the entire Mediterranean world and beyond. The Romans were fascinated by Sparta. Roman writers praised Spartan discipline, Spartan austerity, Spartan civic virtue. The Roman ideal of the soldier-citizen who subordinates personal comfort to collective duty owes a profound debt to the Spartan model, or at least to the Roman image of the Spartan model, which was itself somewhat idealized. This admiration persisted through the medieval period, intensified during the Renaissance, and exploded in the 18th century when European intellectuals searching for alternatives to what they saw as the corruption and excess of their own societies found in Sparta an idealized image of austere virtue and civic discipline. Jean-Jacques Rousseau admired Sparta. The French revolutionaries admired Sparta. The Jacobins, in their most radical phase, explicitly invoked Spartan imagery and values. Lacedaemon, the ancient name for the Spartan state, became a byword for republican virtue. This is the third wow fact, and it is one that most people never consider. The Spartan myth has been one of the most politically potent historical images in Western history, invoked by movements ranging from democratic revolutionaries to authoritarian nationalists, from educational reformers to military theorists, from feminist writers who emphasized Spartan women's unusual freedoms to conservative thinkers who emphasized Spartan social discipline. Almost every political tradition has found something in Sparta to admire, and almost every political tradition has used that admiration selectively, ignoring the parts of the Spartan reality that did not fit their agenda. The most obvious thing that gets ignored is the helots. The Spartan system was built on slavery, not the relatively mild household slavery that existed in many ancient societies, but a systematic, institutionalized, multi-generational subjugation of an entire people. The helots were not a minor footnote to Spartan history, they were its foundation. Every Spartan virtue that later admirers celebrated, the discipline, the austerity, the communal equality among citizens, was possible only because there was an enslaved class doing the agricultural and domestic labor that Spartan citizens were forbidden from performing themselves. The equality of the homoioi was purchased at the price of the helots' freedom, dignity, and lives. This is not a modern imposition of contemporary values on an ancient society. Ancient Greeks were aware of the moral problem. Helot revolts were a constant threat that shaped every aspect of Spartan policy. The annual declaration of war on the helots was not a comfortable institution. It was a sign of how much violence was required to maintain the system. When Sparta was weakened after Leuctra, the helots of Messenia did not hesitate. They took their freedom the moment it was offered. But the complexity goes even further than that. Because even within the Spartan citizen class, the system was not what it appeared. The myth of Spartan equality, the homoioi, the equals, masked significant real inequalities. Land was not equally distributed. Wealthy Spartan families had larger estates and more resources than poorer ones. The ephorate, theoretically open to all citizens, was in practice dominated by established families with the connections and resources to win elections. And the kings, despite their constitutional constraints, remained enormously powerful figures whose personal decisions shaped Spartan history in ways that no amount of institutional checking could fully control. King Pausanias, the victor of Plataea, was later tried and exiled. King Cleomenes I, one of the most energetic and controversial Spartan kings of the late 6th century, was said to have gone mad, though some modern historians suspect the madness was a convenient political diagnosis applied to a king whose behavior had become inconvenient. King Agesilaus II, who dominated Spartan policy for much of the 4th century, was brilliant, personally brave, and arguably one of the architects of Sparta's overextension and eventual decline, a figure whose virtues and flaws were inseparable from each other. The Spartan system, for all its emphasis on collective discipline and the suppression of individual ambition, produced individuals of extraordinary complexity. It also produced a society that was, in some ways, more culturally rich than its austere reputation suggests. Early Sparta. The Sparta of the 7th and early 6th centuries BC, before the full development of the militarized system, was actually a center of artistic and cultural production. Spartan pottery was exported across the Mediterranean. Spartan bronze work was highly regarded. Spartan choral music and poetry were celebrated throughout Greece. The poet Alcman, who worked in Sparta in the 7th century BC, wrote choral odes of considerable sophistication and beauty. The famous Spartan love of music, particularly the aulos, a double-piped wind instrument, was not just background entertainment. It was integrated into military training, with soldiers marching and fighting to musical rhythms. Even in the classical period, Spartan culture was not the complete cultural desert that the myth sometimes suggests. The Spartans maintained elaborate religious festivals, including the Gymnopediae, a festival involving choral performances by boys, youths, and men, and the Carneia, a festival in honor of Apollo that was so important that it could delay military campaigns, as it did when the Spartan army arrived late to Marathon in 490 BC. The Spartans built temples and maintained sacred sites. They had a rich tradition of oral poetry and sayings. The laconic wit for which they were famous was itself a cultural achievement, a cultivated style of communication that required intelligence and precision. What Sparta did not produce, in its classical period, was the kind of written intellectual culture that Athens generated. No Spartan Thucydides recorded Spartan history from the inside. No Spartan Socrates questioned the foundations of Spartan values in public dialogue. The Agoge did not encourage that kind of thinking. Whether this was a loss or simply a different set of priorities is a question worth sitting with. By the Hellenistic period, the era following Alexander the Great's conquests beginning in the late 4th century BC, Sparta had become something of a living museum. It retained its institutions, its traditions, its kings, its ephors, its agoge, but its power was a shadow of what it had been. The Greek world had been transformed by Alexander's conquests, which had spread Greek culture across an enormous swath of the ancient world, while simultaneously making the old city-state rivalries seem parochial and irrelevant. There were attempts at revival. In the 3rd century BC, two reforming kings, Agis IV and Cleomenes the Free, tried to restore the Spartan system to something like its original form, redistributing land, expanding the citizen roles, reviving the agoge in its full rigor. Both attempts ended in failure and personal tragedy. Agis was executed by the ephors he had tried to reform. Cleomenes was defeated in battle, fled to Egypt, and died there in circumstances that ancient sources describe as a failed uprising against his Egyptian hosts. The final chapter came with Rome. Sparta was eventually absorbed into the Roman world, first as a nominally free allied city and later as simply another provincial town. But even under Roman rule, Sparta maintained a kind of performance of its past. The agoge continued, or a version of it did, as a tourist attraction as much as a genuine institution. Wealthy Romans visited Sparta to watch the ritual flogging at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, which had become a spectacle for visitors rather than a genuine test of endurance. The city that had once refused to build walls because its men were its walls now traded on its reputation as entertainment for the empire that had absorbed it. There is something both sad and strangely fitting about this. Sparta had always been, to some extent, a performance, a society that cultivated a very specific image of itself and projected that image with enormous skill. The Romans watching the ritual flogging were not entirely wrong to see it as a show, but they were wrong to think that the show was all there had ever been. What then, is the honest verdict on Sparta. What do we take away from this extraordinary, troubling, fascinating experiment in human social organization? Sparta was real. The discipline was real. The military excellence was real. The communal bonds that made Spartan soldiers fight, with a cohesion that repeatedly shocked their opponents, were real. The political institutions, the dual kingship, the Ephyret, the Gerousia, the Apella, were genuinely innovative and genuinely functional for centuries. The unusual freedoms of Spartan women, relative to their Greek contemporaries, were real and meaningful. The courage at Thermopylae was real, and it deserves to be honored. But the system that produced all of this was also built on a foundation of institutionalized violence against the helots that we cannot simply bracket as a product of its time and move on. Every ancient society had slavery in some form, but not every ancient society built its entire social structure around the permanent subjugation of a specific conquered people. The Spartan system required the helots to be kept in a state of terror. It required annual declarations of war against them. It required a secret police that moved through the countryside at night. This was not incidental to Sparta. It was structural, and the system ultimately failed on its own terms. It could not sustain the citizen class it depended on. It could not adapt when its military supremacy was broken. It could not survive the loss of millennia. A society that devoted itself so completely to military excellence that it neglected almost everything else, economic development, intellectual innovation, cultural production, demographic growth, turned out to be less durable than the societies it had despised for their softness. Athens, for all its turbulence and its own considerable moral failures, produced a body of art, philosophy, science, and political thought that has shaped human civilization continuously for 2,500 years. Sparta produced a legend. The legend is powerful, and the legend is real, but it is not the same thing as a civilization. And yet the legend matters. The reason we are still talking about Sparta, the reason it still generates books and films and debates, is not simply because of the spectacle of 300 men at a mountain pass. It is because Sparta forces us to ask questions that do not have easy answers. What do we owe to our community versus what we owe to ourselves? What is the relationship between discipline and freedom? What does it cost to be excellent at one thing, and what do you give up? How do we weigh the achievements of a society against the suffering it inflicted to achieve them? These are not ancient questions. They are questions that every society, in every era, has to answer for itself. Sparta answered them in a particular way, and the answer lasted for centuries and left marks on history that are still visible today. Whether it was the right answer is something you get to decide. What is certain is that the real Sparta, complicated, brutal, impressive, contradictory, and ultimately mortal, is far more interesting than the myth. The myth is a story about invincibility. The reality is a story about what happens when human beings push one particular set of values to their absolute limit, sustain it across generations through extraordinary collective will, and then discover that no system, however strong, is permanent. The Eurotas still flows through the valley between the mountains. The modern town of Sparta sits near the ancient site, a quiet, pleasant Greek town with a population of around 17,000 people. There is a statue of Leonidas near the ancient Acropolis. There is an archaeological museum with finds from the site. Tourists come and go. The mountains are still there, still dramatic, still beautiful. And somewhere in the olive groves and the dry summer heat, if you're paying attention, you can almost feel the weight of what happened here. The extraordinary human experiment that played out in this valley over the course of 500 years. The lives lived and lost in service of an idea about what human beings could be if they were willing to pay the price. The question Sparta leaves us with is not whether we would want to live that way. Most of us would not. The question is what we are willing to sacrifice for the things we believe in, and whether we are honest about what that sacrifice costs, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us. That question has no expiration date. If this video made you think about Sparta differently, if the real story surprised you, challenged you, or just made you want to know more, then leave a comment below. I genuinely want to know, which part of Spartan history hit you hardest? Was it the helot system? The demographic collapse? The strange afterlife of the Spartan myth? Tell me. And if you want to go deeper into the world of ancient Greece, the Persian Wars, the rise of Athens, the life of Alexander, the fall of the classical world, subscribe and stay close, because we are just getting started. The next video is already waiting for you.